swift jab on the starter button and the engine roared and revved to peak as Ted Harris swung the truck round in a lock which almost flung Curly Bates out onto the road. He held on to his guns and the Vickers pointed to the star-gemmed skies for a second or so before he recovered his balance. By that time the lorry was facing the approaching tanks. For a matter of seconds the advantage of surprise was still with the Britishers, for the men in the light tanks still did not know whether the lorry coming towards them was one of their own or an enemy. That it could be a British truck seemed too fantastic for belief, for the spot was several hundred miles behind their front lines. "Give him the works, China," Ted Harris ordered, "and be ready to jump. I'm going to try to swing her round straight across the road. Curly, open up." Rat-a-tat-tat-tat-tat, even against the background of crackling and roaring from the score or more burning aircraft, with the sounds of exploding ammunition to add to the din, the chattering of Curly's twin Vickers was heard on the road. He had a good target, and his bullets struck sparks on the armour plating of the first tank, but it was like firing dried peas at an elephant. His only hope was that a bullet might get through one of the tank's vision slits. Within seconds of opening up there was a reply from the first tank. Seeming to coincide with the muzzle flash, the lorry swung sideways, and a second later heaved upwards as the shell which had struck the near side front wheel exploded. Just how keyed up the three Britishers were, however, showed in their reactions to the flash. They knew they could not hope to stand up to anti-tank gunfire. Like jack-in-the-box figures all worked by the same spring, they leapt at the flash. Sergeant Ted Harris flung himself sideways as the truck began to heave. China lobbed a grenade at the tank, then huddled down. Curly Bates was outlined for a moment by the glow from the airfield, a wild-looking figure with arms out as he jumped as far as he could in the direction of the sea. Whoomp! Whoomp! 2 explosions followed within 2 seconds. The first lifted the truck as if it had been a toy, threw it onto its side and shot China Brown out in a perfect parabola so that he hit the ground within a foot of Ted Harris. The second explosion took place directly below the tank, whose driver had hurriedly stamped his feet down on the clutches and brought both tracks to a grinding halt. The driver of the second tank tried to swing to one side, for he was racing hard behind his number one, and had not expected such an abrupt full stop. He was just a foot short of clearing his leader, but it was a vital 12 inches. There was a crunch and a screech of metal on metal. Number 2 tank stopped, and in the momentary silence which followed, there was an almost inaudible clank, clank, clank. The near side track of the second tank had been snapped, and the sound was that of the Caterpillar sections flopping forward onto the road. The 30 CWT lorry, with her name, the Fighting Four, painted brilliant red on the bonnet, teetered for a second or so on her side, as if she was trying to do a balancing act. Then she turned over. Flames were already licking up from her shattered engine, and those rose in the air to light up her front wheels, still spinning madly. On the track side, the 3 Britishers did not behave as though they had just been catapulted from a moving vehicle. Trained as parachute jumpers with their earlier commando unit, they knew how to fall when moving at speed. They had collected a few bruises, but this kind of fighting was not new to them. They had fought with commandos in Norway and North Germany, as well as in Italy. As a team they worked like clockwork. They were partly in the shadow here and had the advantage over the tank commanders in that they could see quite easily what was going on, while the men in the tanks were forced to do their viewing through armoured slits. "Got one from China?" Ted Harris asked as he crouched low and ran a dozen yards before flinging himself down again. China Brown blessed the fact that he did keep hand grenades in his pockets. They could be uncomfortable, but for moments like this a grenade in the pocket was worth a score in a wrecked lorry. China did not run. He knew exactly what was going to happen in a few moments. The 2 tanks had completely blocked the road. Whatever happened to Sergeant Ted Harris, China and Curly, they had done just what Major Corey had asked of them. They had blocked the road and stopped the light tanks, thus giving the SAS raiders the chance to get off the airfield. The foremost tank did begin firing at the raiders as the jeep started to push out through the airfield gate. It was then that China lobbed his first grenade. He carried 4 in his pockets. He had given them 4, 5, 6 and 7 second fuses. He threw the grenade with the 4 second fuse and flattened to the ground at once. The grenade dropped with a clatter just in front of the anti-tank gun which had already fired 2 rounds at the retreating SAS vehicles. Then the grenade exploded. There was a crack, and when the flash had gone there seemed to be no damage at all, but the gun did not begin firing again. The men behind the gun, if not killed, must have been at least too shocked for further action. The turret of the tank opened, and the German heaved himself out. He was a brave man, but the Luger automatic in his right hand never spat flame. China's 5-second fused grenade went off in the air above the tank. The tank commander flopped forward, then was dragged inside and the turret top closed. By this time, however, men were getting out of the tanks farther down the road, and China did not wait. There was a time for fighting and there was a time for running. This he knew was the time for showing that if he had been given proper training, he might have done quite well as a cross-country runner. He streaked away towards the sea and was joined by Ted Harris and Curly a moment after he passed them. From the direction of the road came flashes and shouts, but none of the bullets fired at them came even close enough to be heard. "Which way, Ted?" Curly gasped, after they had battled along for several minutes. "Not that it matters so much, but when I left the lorry I lost one of my chapleys." One of the things the long-range desert group used instead of boots was a very light sandal copied from the Eastern chapley, a slipper which was little more than a piece of leather fastened to the foot by straps or even thin cord. For desert work they were better than boots, being taken off and dusted free from sand much quicker than a boot is. The big disadvantage, especially in an affray of this kind, was that they were easily lost. "Well, if you're tired," Ted grunted, stopping, "I suppose any excuse is better than none." "Excuse?" Curly snarled. "Why, Ted laughed. "No sense of humour. I feel sorry for you, Curly. You can't see anything funny ever. I was just pulling your leg, you booby." "Well, maybe you'll have to pull one leg," Curly said tartly, "'cause if I've to walk far with nothing on one foot, that foot is going to get worn away and I'll be going Hopalong Cassidy. When that happens, you can pull my leg to make it as long as the other." "Isn't he wonderful?" China said, the darkness hiding his grin. "When he gets going like that, you realise what a strong, silent man he is." "Okay, that'll do," Sergeant Harris said. "Let's have a look at your foot." Masking the torch he carried until its beam was only a thin pensive light, he examined Curly's foot. It was bleeding, and he had obviously been unlucky enough to stand on either a piece of glass or perhaps a discarded length of old barbed wire. Sergeant Harris opened his own first field dressing, and when he had finished bandaging Curly's foot, he took off his own right chapley. "Put that on, Curly." "No, I'll be all right. No use two of us getting crippled," Curly protested. "I reckon we've a tidy walk in front of us, and maybe I'd better take it easy. So I'll—" "Private Bates," Ted snapped. "When I give an order, I expect it to be obeyed. Do you want me to put you on the peg when we get back? Disobeying orders when on the field of battle? Go on, you muggins, get it on." And the last few words carried a chuckle. They rested for another quarter of an hour, listening for any sound which might suggest the Germans had sent a party to search for them. They could see the tanks silhouetted against the glow of the fires on the airfield. They could see that several men were working on the first two cripples, but there was no sound or sign of pursuit. "I reckon we ought to get a medal for this," China said and slapped his chest. "Isn't there a pension with the Victoria Cross, Ted?" "It'll be VC, Sergeant Harris, if you don't remember I'm Sergeant Harris and not Ted." As they moved on, Ted laid a hand on China's shoulder as he added, chuckling, "VC standing for Very Cross, not Victoria Cross. I don't think we'd get a medal, not unless the Major actually saw us stop the tanks. Trouble is, somebody's got to see you doing your stuff." "Well, I saw you and you saw me," China said, laughing softly. Then, changing the subject, said, "Don't you wish you were like that pantomime bloke, Aladdin? Just fancy, you rub the old lamp, and when the genie or whatever he was called appears, you say, 'Okay, bud, fetch 3 big glasses and a jug of cold.'" "Stow it, China," Ted said soberly. "Let's get moving. We've a long way to go before we drink. No use tormenting ourselves." They walked west for about 1.5 miles, then crossed the coast road again. No traffic was moving, and the sky was still red with the glow from the flames at the airfield. What they did not know was that a petrol tanker had been hit and set alight, and before the Germans could move them, 2 more tankers had also caught fire. It was a wonderful night's work for the SAS and the Long-Range Desert Group Patrol, and a bad blow for the Germans. Before dawn greyed the sky in the east, Ted Harris had been forced to borrow the first field dressings of China and Curly to wrap about his unshod foot. A march across the African desert is not a march across soft sand. There is sand and there are rocks, there is thorny scrub, and there are dried up waddies where the baked mud is as hard as new brick. No one complained, no one mentioned thirst or tiredness. They were a tough trio, but they had just about had enough when the sun lifted above the horizon. They had travelled all night by compass, for each man had a tiny compass sewn on his coat as a button. When the cloth was pushed back, it revealed the dial and the luminous needle. Gratefully they took off their sheepskin coats. They had been glad enough of them during the night, for winter nights in the desert can be bitterly cold. "I suppose we'll have to cart these along with us, Ted," China suggested. Ted Horace nodded, and there was a wry grin on his face when he said, "If I thought we were sure of finding our chaps today, I might be tempted to say forget them. Trouble is—" and there he stopped. Curly Bates took out his cigarette case, and when the other two had accepted cigarettes and were smoking, they moved on. The wadi where the lorries should be was less than a mile away, and they were dropping into it when they heard the drone of aircraft engines. "That's the one thing I don't like about this desert game," Curly growled. "A fellow in the desert has about as much chance of being unseen as a single pea on a soup plate. I'd like to have a flip in the air, just to get an idea what a lorry looks like from—" "It's a Ghibli, down you go," Sergeant Horace ordered, and all three slid over the lip of the wadi and made for the shelter of a few stunted acacia bushes, all thorns and little leaf. Looking up, they saw the twin-engined Italian Ghibli slide over. It had lined itself up for a run right to where the wadi tailed off into the open desert, and it was at the desert end about a mile away that the British trucks would be waiting. "Strikes me Jerry must have got really annoyed about the raid last night," China said, allowing smoke to dribble from his nostrils, and looking at his cigarette as if wondering whether he ought to nip off the glowing end and save what remained for another smoke. "It's getting quite a habit with him these days, of sending a plane out when we've done anything." Sergeant Horace snorted. "What do you want him to do, get all togged up and cut a birthday cake because we've burnt up a score or so of his aircraft? What do you think we'd do if some German long-range desert rats got behind our lines and started burning aircraft and shooting up—" There he stopped, for far from the desert end of the wadi had come the rat-a-tat-tat of machine-gun fire. "Looks as if the pilots spotted the boys," China said casually. "I hope they give him the works." "I hope they ignore him," Curly said smartly. "If he thinks he's made a mistake, he might sheer off. If somebody starts throwing hot lead at him, well, he'll probably whistle up some Jerry planes, and they're a heck of a sight worse than the ITs. Jerry pilots always mean business." The drone of engines began to fade, and the trio left their cover. Getting into the bottom of the wadi, the dried-up watercourse making a fairly decent roadway, they started to trot. Ahead there was water, food, and for Sergeant Horace a spare sandal. Within a couple of minutes, however, the Ghibli returned. It dived down onto the hidden lorries, dropped 2 bombs, then soared into the air again and began to circle. "We'd better catch up with our mob," Sergeant Horace said, pressing his elbows into his sides and increasing his speed. "I'll bet you anything you like that pilot's calling up reinforcements as hard as he can. If he does, down lads, here he comes again." The Italian, for all the hard names the British troops gave the Italians, was sticking to his job, and he suddenly appeared out of the sun, diving as fast as his twin engines could drag him along. His top speed was not quite 180 miles per hour, but coming in low over the wadi, he seemed to the 3 watchers to travel like a shooting star. Once again, within 20 seconds, there came the thud, thud, thud of 3 small bombs. Sergeant Horace watched the plane, his eyes screwed up against the sun. The Ghibli turned in a tight half-circle and dived back again, this time with machine guns hammering away. There was no need to warn China and Curly to get down. They dived for the side of the wadi, curled up into as tight a ball as possible, and hoped that none of the lifting spurts of dust where bullets were kicking into the sun-baked ground would come their way. With a roar like thunder, the Ghibli passed over them. They heard the engine note rise to a scream as the pilot gave it full boost so that he could make a tight turn, and then he was coming back once more. "This is getting past a joke," China growled. "Cor, I wish I was sitting back of my twin Vickers. I'd send him home to his macaroni in quick time." "Or get yourself full of lead," Curly scoffed. "You never were any good with those guns of yours." "If you've any sense," Sergeant Horace advised, "you'll save your breath. When this fellow runs out of ammo, I'm going to do even time up to the lorries. I have a feeling the boys will pull out the first chance they get. Neither the Major nor Pom-Pom are going to wait until the dive bombers come along." For another 10 minutes, however, it was just suicide of thinking of moving up the wadi. The Italian pilot was certainly doing a splendid job of work in keeping the raiders penned in the wadi. When he did turn and head back to the base, where there was another sound to take the place of the roar of his engines, the new sound came from a flight of 3 German Stukas, Hitler's best dive bombers. They came in one behind the other and screamed over the top of the wadi, apparently just to make sure where the target was. They swept over the lorries and went up, climbing swiftly, before turning to make their first dive attacks. I knew it, Sergeant Harris said savagely. Well, we've missed the boats. The boys are off. They're not waiting for the Stukas. It was not possible to see the lorries, but there was no doubt they were getting out of that death trap. The top of the wadi was now filled with yellow dust as lorry after lorry, engines screaming at peak, beat it for the open where they could scatter and present as small a target as possible. The Stukas came down with engines roaring on such a high note that it hurts the ears. Then, just before they straightened out to start climbing again, each pilot released one bomb. Sergeant Harris and his two friends ran the 3/4 of a mile to where the wadi opened out into the desert in what must have been record time. They wanted to know what was happening. If the Stukas had a good hunt, then there would be several hundred weary miles between the three Britishers and their nearest base. The scene which met the eyes of the trio brought no joy to their hearts. Less than 1/4 of a mile from them, a column of smoke was rising from a burning British lorry. 200 yards farther on, another lorry, which all three recognised immediately as being the one Major Corry used, was stopped. One wheel had been blown off and the lorry was tilted. Farther away, each heading in a different direction, were the other lorries, showing only as puffs of yellow dust. Two of the Stukas were concentrating on one lorry. The third Stuka was coming in at that moment to finish off the Major's lorry. Someone was standing on the back of the lorry, firing upwards with the calm assurance of someone on a target range. He's going to buy it in a big way, China snapped. Why doesn't he scoot the clown? Oh boy, what do you make of that, Curly? That's what I call fighting. You called it something else a moment back, Ted Harris snapped, without taking his eyes off the Stuka. The plane had been hit, smoke was pouring from its engine, and the pilot was making a tremendous fight to level off and make an emergency landing. Though the action which followed lasted only a few seconds, it was seen by the three watchers like something from a slow-motion film. They saw the smoke and flames in the starboard wing suddenly mushroom, and then part of the plane itself fell away. It tumbled to earth, flashing silvery as it caught the sun's rays. The Stuka, suddenly out of balance, turned and nosedived. Get out! For once even Sergeant Ted Harris, veteran of Dunkirk, Norway and several commando raids, could not restrain himself as he saw what was going to happen. The sudden nosedive was going to take the blazing Stuka right down onto the British truck. The man in the back tried to hop off, one leg hanging limp. He's wounded, Curly gasped, but no one bothered to point that out. They had eyes for themselves and could see. It's the Major himself, Ted Harris groaned, and then it happened. The plane hit the earth, seemed to bounce over towards the truck, and then there was a flash of light so brilliant that it was blinding, even against the dazzling light of the desert sun. The lorry seemed to take wings. It lifted into the air, and with it went the solitary limping figure, and then everything was hidden in a mushrooming cloud of yellow dust, mingled with the black smoke of burning oil. The crackle of burning and the popping of ammunition exploding in the heat were the only audible sounds to the three watchers then. The chase by the other Stukas had gone east and south. The puffs of yellow dust churned up by the racing lorries was vanishing. Apart from the sounds from the burning plane, quietness had come to the desert again. Got a match? Ted Harris asked, bringing the stub of cigarette from behind his ear. Ta. Well, Curly, and you too, China. I'm reminded of the days when we were doing commando training in Scotland, and you kept sighing for a desert island where there was nothing but peace. You're going to get plenty of nothing from now on. Eh? China was taking a light from Curly. What do you mean, nothing? Just what I said, was the grim retort. We had our bit of fun last night. Now it's Jerry's innings. The boys are beating it as fast as they can. We've lost 2 trucks, and I don't know about you two, but I haven't any rations and I haven't a water bottle. China and Curly looked at one another, then both looked at their sergeant. But they'll come back for us surely, they said together. Sergeant Harris shook his head slowly but definitely. There are several reasons why they won't, he said crisply. First, they don't know we are here. I reckon the Major would write us off last night. After all, it isn't often a lorry can take on even light tanks and get out in one piece, so they won't be expecting us to get here. Second reason, Jerry's out for blood. He's got 2 lorries already, so our blokes will be heading for places out of Jerry's reach as fast as the lorries will take them. And you mean we're here on our own? Curly asked. You tell him, Ted said, nudging China Brown, and tell him how lucky he is. I'm short a sandal. If we get back, we'll be walking. So 2 chappies means something. They sat down to stare southeast. They could just hear the faint drone of aero engines telling them that the Stukas was still trying to wipe out the SAS jeeps and the lorries of the long-range Desert Group patrol. Then the Stukas came back, and as they passed over the scene where the smoke was rising from the burning plane, both dive bombers did a slow roll, either in homage to a comrade who had gone, or as a victory roll to show they had chalked up some good bombing. "All over now, bar the shouting," Ted Harris said, lighting another cigarette. "I think they'll come back," Curly muttered obstinately. They sat in the sun for another hour watching and waiting, but strained their eyes to the southeast though they did, nothing broke the yellow expanse of desert. No puff of smoke to tell them a lorry was on its way back to pick them up. Not even a black dot to tell them a man was walking their way. "How far to the nearest water, Sarge?" China asked, getting to his feet and knocking the fine yellow sand from the seat of his shorts. 3 days by lorry, Ted said. "Think you can walk it?" China sat down again and muttered, 3 days by lorry? Why, I'm dried up now. I suppose it means walking to the coast and becoming a prisoner of war, eh?" At that Curly rose and gave a grunt of disdain. "Prisoner of war? Come on, Sarge, let's get mobile. You never know your luck. We might meet an Arab water carrier or something. So long, China. See you after the war." It was then that Ted Harris gave a sudden excited whistle and asked, "Here, am I seeing things? Down there? I'd have sworn he moved."